Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Living Room Radio, where we discuss topics of science, the metaphysical, life, and everything in between. I'm your host, Drew Rosenblatt, and tonight we have the pleasure of speaking with Michael Cremo. Michael is in no need of an introduction. His books Forbidden Archaeology, Human De-Evolution, a Vedic Alternative to Darwin's Theory, and more have made a huge impact on our understanding of human history and man's origins, categorically presenting overwhelming evidence of anatomically modern human beings existing hundreds of millions of years ago. Forbidden Archaeology has been hailed as one of the landmark intellectual achievements of the late 20th century, just as relevant today as the day it came out. Michael, thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Good to be with you and all your listeners.
Yes, sir. I was hoping we could start off with a bit of a refresher for everyone on all the evidence for cases of extreme human antiquity, artifacts, and we can just maybe start. So how about some of these findings in lumps of coal? It's just astonishing when someone is breaking apart a big chunk of coal and out pops a beautifully crafted metal bell or something along those lines. Can we go ahead and start talking maybe on that tone?
Well, yes. I think the first thing we should understand is that according to modern science, the mainstream consensus, human beings like us first appeared less than 200,000 years ago. And they would say before that time, there were no human beings like us. There were simply more primitive ape-like human ancestors, and before that, just some primitive apes and monkeys. So, in my book, Forbidden Archaeology, I documented evidence showing that humans like us have been present for far longer than the 200,000 years or so that most scientists now accept. And, some of the evidence I documented is relatively close to what most scientists are now prepared to accept in terms of human antiquity. In other words, they say humans have been around for 200,000 years, and I show there are discoveries showing they've been around 400,000 years or 800,000 years or 1,000,000 years. But some of the cases I mentioned go much further back in time, and the ones that you have particularly mentioned, objects found in coal, are very old. Most coal dates back to the Carboniferous period, which goes back about 250, 300 million years ago. So it's really quite old. And one of these cases involves a gold chain that was found in a block of coal. This was reported in the Morrisonville Times, which is a newspaper that was published in Illinois in 1891. And in this town of Morrisonville was a lady named Culp, Mrs. Culp, and she was putting some coal into her coal-burning stove, and she broke apart one of the bigger chunks, to make it fit better. And inside, she found a gold chain about 10 inches long. So this is really kind of unusual because you normally wouldn't expect to find a piece of jewelry like that coming from a piece of coal that's about 300 million years old or so. Yeah, I mean, we asked the Illinois State Geological Survey how old the coal was from the mines in that area, and they told us the coal there dates from about 260 million to about 320 million years old. There are other instances of objects having been found in coal. In 1897, a newspaper in Omaha, Nebraska, reported that a carved stone was found in a coal mine, the Lehigh coal mine near Webster, Iowa. And it was found about 130 feet deep in the mine, solidly embedded in the coal. And this piece of stone, which was of a dark gray color, it was about 2 feet long, 1 foot wide, about 4 inches thick. It had on its surface a script in some unknown language. Actually, it had some geometrical figures on it in the shapes of diamonds. And again, we got in touch with the Iowa State Historical Preservation Office of State Archaeology, and they told us that the coal in that mine, again, dates to the Carboniferous period. But there was another interesting object found in coal. It's an iron cup that came from a piece of coal. It was actually discovered in 1912 when a man named Frank J. Kenwood was working in the municipal electric plant in Thomas, Oklahoma. And, you know, he was shoveling coal into the furnace of the electrical generating power plant. And he broke open a big chunk of coal because it was too big. He broke it with a sledgehammer, and this iron cup or iron pot came out of the center of the piece of coal, and he could see it had been embedded in the piece of coal because in the broken piece of coal there was the impression of this iron cup or iron pot. And, you know, he wrote an affidavit testifying to all of this. And, you know, he did some research for his affidavit, and he found out that the coal came from the Wilburton, Oklahoma coal mine, and the coal from that Wilburton mine is about 312 million years old. I actually saw this object a few years ago. There was a man in Vienna, Austria, named Klaus Dona, and you know, he's a man who's very interested in archaeological evidence for extreme human antiquity. And he had collected from all over the world, from different private collections and museums, dozens and dozens of human artifacts that are extremely old, and he exhibited them in a museum in Vienna, Austria. You know, it was a temporary exhibit. He had just been able to get these objects from private collections and museums around the world for this exhibition that he put on in Vienna, Austria, and he invited me to speak at a conference that was held in connection with the opening of this display. And at the display, I saw this iron pot that came from the Wilburton coal mine in Oklahoma in 1912. So there are a number of objects like this. So I just thought I'd mention some of them.
Yeah, who knows if ancient artifacts are still being dug up today, but just, because of our heavy machinery, that we just don't have the same sort of finesse that these people were using way back, in the 1800s and early 1900s.
Right, you're absolutely right about that. Back in those days, the coal mining operations were more hands-on. The coal miners were able to do that. Now it's very mechanized, so that the coal is taken out by huge machines that grind the coal into small pieces, and it's not so hands-on as it used to be. And there was another instance, not of a artifact being found, but of a block wall being found in a coal mine in Heavener, I don't know how you pronounce it, Heavener, Oklahoma, in the year 1928. There was a man named William McCormick who was working, actually, his grandfather, William McCormick's grandfather, is a man named Atlas Alman Mathis. He was working in this coal mine about 2 miles down in the ground in Heavener, Oklahoma, and they had been blasting out what they call rooms in the coal. That's how they were operating. They would set off a dynamite charge, and then they would clear out the coal from what they called a room. So while clearing out the coal from this, what they call a room in this mine, Mr. Mathis noted that at the end of one of the rooms, there was a wall of concrete blocks, about 12 inches square each, and were very smooth and polished. He said, so smooth you could almost see your reflection in it. And, when this was reported, that they hit this wall, they were taken out of the mine, and the mine was closed, and they were sent, the miners were sent somewhere else. So that's not an artifact. It's more like an architectural structure, that was found deep in a coal mine,
right,
in coal deposits about 300 million years old. So, but I think you're right that the modern mining methods are somewhat different, and they're highly mechanized, and the coal just gets scraped out and ground up,
yeah.
even under the ground.
You said this wall was found 2 miles underground. Sometimes I think you have to kind of really visualize how far of a distance that is underground to really fully appreciate the impact of that find, you know. I mean, 2 miles,
Yeah.
that's outrageous, you know.
Yeah, so it's so there are that's just one category of evidence, things that are found in coal mines, and I suspect that many more things have been discovered, but just never got reported so that people know about them. I can imagine many miners during this period, during the late 19th century, early 20th century, were finding these things, but you know, they just kept it to themselves or to a close circle of friends, and it never got known to a wider public. And maybe they kept the object on their mantelpiece for a while, then after they died, it just got lost or something like that.
Right.
And it may be a fact that people even today in parts of the world where mining is going on with more simple, natural, hands-on techniques are still finding these things, but you know, it's not being reported to a wider public. So I think what I reported in terms of coal mine discoveries in my book Forbidden Archaeology is just the tip of the iceberg, really.
Right, right. Yeah, it's not really their incentive to preserve and protect these finds. You know, they're just more in it for mining for profit, you know. So who knows? I mean, yeah, there could have been pressure on them just to continue, and yeah, you didn't see that.
Well, another category of discoveries made in mines is things that have turned up in gold mines. One of the cases that I've always found very interesting is the California gold mine discoveries.
Mm-hmm.
In the 19th century, gold was discovered in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California, and miners went there to get the gold. And to get the gold, they were digging tunnels into the sides of mountains like Table Mountain in Tuolumne County near the town of Sonora in the Sierra Nevada mountains. And deep inside these tunnels, the miners were finding human bones and human artifacts in layers of rock that modern geologists tell us are about 50 million years old, from the geological period called the Eocene, the early Eocene. So these discoveries came to the attention of Dr. J.D. Whitney, who was the chief government geologist of California. So, you know, he went out and visited some of the sites and interviewed the people who had discovered these things. And he published a massive study about them. It was published by Harvard University in the year 1880, documenting all these discoveries of human artifacts, such as stone mortars and pestles, obsidian spear points, arrowheads, spearheads, and things like that. So these, along with human bones, were found in these very, very ancient layers of rock. But what I find interesting is that Whitney was a prominent scientist, and his report was published by one of America's top educational institutions, Harvard University. But, you know, we don't read anything about these discoveries in today's textbooks of archaeology or history. And that's because of what I call a process of knowledge filtration that operates in the scientific world. If you've got a dominant theory, then what you find is that reports of evidence that conform to the dominant theory pass through the knowledge filter that operates in the world of science, which means this evidence gets included in the textbooks and things like that. But if you have reports of evidence that radically contradict the dominant consensus, they tend to be filtered out. They tend to be forgotten, set aside, dismissed. And in the case of the California gold mine discoveries that were reported by Dr. Whitney, here's how the knowledge filtering process operated. There was another scientist, a colleague of Whitney's, Dr. William Holmes, who was an anthropologist working at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. So he was more highly placed, you could say. Dr. Whitney was out in California, where he was the chief government geologist, California. Dr. Holmes was working in this very powerful Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. So he used his position of power and influence to declare in one of his reports, if Dr. Whitney had understood the theory of human evolution, he wouldn't have come to those conclusions that he published. In other words, Holmes was saying, in effect, if the facts don't support this dominant theory, then the facts should be cast into oblivion. And basically, that's what happened. However, some of the artifacts from the California gold mines are still in the collection of the Museum of Anthropology at the University of California at Berkeley. They're not displayed to the public, but they are still there. And I got permission from the directors of the museum to see them and photograph them. They're not kept in the museum itself. They're kept in a storage building several miles from the museum, but they are still there, and I have personally seen them. And I also went into the Sierra Nevada mountains of California, to places like Table Mountain, and I was able to relocate some of the old 19th century gold mining tunnels where these objects reported by Dr. Whitney were originally discovered. So it's it's a really fascinating case, human bones and human artifacts going back about 50 million years, but we don't really hear too much about them today because of this process of what I call knowledge filtration. I was able to present a paper about these California gold mine discoveries at a meeting of the World Archaeological Congress, which is one of the world's largest international organizations of archaeologists. So there are some archaeologists who are willing to listen to this sort of thing, and I think that's an important first step, because if ideas are eventually going to change, the first step is people have to be willing to listen to evidence that contradicts the existing ideas, and we'll see ultimately where that process leads.
Right. In a sane world, artifacts of that nature, I would think, would be heralded, in the very first room of any museum for public display. And it just seems kind of ridiculous that they're hiding them, basically. They haven't been destroyed or anything, but to keep them in a storage building miles away, I mean, it seems insane to me. But good job for being able to go look at them and document them. That's awesome.
Yeah. I mean, the scientists involved in these things, it's not necessarily that they think they're hiding true evidence, which if known would cause people to disbelieve in their theories. They've been educated in a certain way as they go through high school and college, getting their various degrees, their undergraduate degrees, their graduate degrees, their postgraduate degrees. They're trained in a certain way, and they're accustomed to think in certain ways, so that they just think, well, something's got to be wrong with these things. They couldn't possibly be that old. I don't know exactly what, but I'm sure if I asked some specialist, they'd be able to tell me. So they don't necessarily think that they're hiding true evidence from people. They just assume, well, there couldn't possibly be any evidence like that. So, and there has to be some explanation for it, which they might not know personally, but which they assume is there somewhere.
Yeah, maybe.
I mean, if nothing else, you could always say, well, it must have been some kind of hoax, or it must have slipped down from some higher level into those very ancient layers of rock, or something. And there's an interesting psychological experiment that was done at one time, which kind of illustrates how this knowledge filtration process operates. It's a psychological experiment that kind of shows that people see not what is really there in front of them, but what they're conditioned to see. It was a very simple experiment. It was written about by Dr. Thomas Kuhn in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which is an important book. Thomas Kuhn was the person who introduced the term paradigm. Paradigm means, in the world of science, the kind of the overall mindset of a scientist, his assumptions, his methodologies, his conclusions, the kind of conclusions that are acceptable, and the whole term paradigm comes from Thomas Kuhn. And he basically saw it as a psychological effect. But there was this experiment that was done with playing cards by some psychologists. What they did is they took a deck of playing cards, and then they altered some of the cards in the deck. Take for example, a six of hearts. You look at a six of hearts, normally it's red. But what they did is they took the six of hearts and they made it black. Or they took, say, the four of spades. Four of spades is normally black, but they turned it red. So they took a deck of cards and they changed some of the cards in it. And then they would take a person and they would show the person the cards in the deck, one after another. And they would ask the person if they saw anything unusual, say something. And what they found is that hardly anyone, almost no one, would notice that the cards had been altered. In other words, they weren't really seeing the cards that were being shown to them. They were seeing them as they were conditioned to see them as they expected
Right.
to see them.
Mm-hmm.
And this happens in the world of science, that sometimes scientists really don't see what's really in front of them. They see what they're conditioned to expect to see. And there's a recent example of that. In 2016, archaeologists at Olduvai Gorge in the country of Tanzania were doing some excavations. Olduvai Gorge is a very famous place in East Africa. A lot of big archaeological discoveries have been made there. Discoveries of different kinds of ape men, like Australopithecus and Homo habilis and like that. So these archaeologists discovered a finger bone. Now this is a small thing, but it illustrates a big point. So they discovered a finger bone. It was actually one of the finger bones, the basal finger bone and the little finger of some creature. And they found it in layers of rock, 1,800,000 years old at Olduvai Gorge. And they very carefully studied this finger bone. They did detailed measurements of it, and then they compared the measurements of this finger bone to the same finger bone in different species of apes and monkeys, different kinds of ape men like Australopithecus, Homo habilis, and they also compared it to anatomically modern human finger bones. And they found it was not like the ape or monkey finger bones. It wasn't like the ape men. It was exactly like an anatomically modern human finger bone, Homo sapiens.
Mm-hmm.
So, in their scientific report, which was published in a journal called Nature Communications, it's one of the top scientific publications in the world, the archaeologists said, this finger bone that we found is just like that of Homo sapiens, but we can't call it Homo sapiens because of the age of the formation in which it was found, 1,800,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, they were looking straight at this evidence. They said, okay, we've got this finger bone. It's just like that of Homo sapiens, and it was solidly embedded in a formation 1,800,000 years old. Seems to me the logical conclusion is you've got evidence for humans like us, Homo sapiens, existing 1,800,000 years ago, but they couldn't see it like that because of their conditioning,
right?
Because they believe Homo sapiens only came into existence less than 200,000 years ago. So they just say, we found this finger bone, it's Homo sapiens and its morphology, but we can't call it Homo sapiens because it's too old. I mean, that's how this process of knowledge filtration operates in the world of science.
Right, right. Oh, weren't there human footprints found in Tanzania that were like 4 million years old or something as well?
Well, in 1979, Mary Leakey, the wife of Louis Leakey, who was a very prominent archaeologist, and she was also, in her own right, a very prominent archaeologist. In 1979, Mary Leakey announced the discovery of footprints from a place called Laetoli in the country of Tanzania. Olduvai Gorge is also in Tanzania, so they're kind of close in the sense of being in the same country in East Africa. Mm-hmm. So these footprints were found in layers of solidified volcanic ash about 3,700,000 years old. So you could round it off to the nearest million. That would be about 4 million years old, but really 3,700,000. Mm-hmm. And in her original report, which was published in National Geographic magazine, Mary Leakey said, these footprints are indistinguishable from anatomically modern human footprints. And other scientists also agreed with her. A very famous paleontologist named Tim White stated, make no mistake about it, these are like modern human footprints. Now, neither Mary Leakey nor Tim White believe that the footprints were made by human beings like us, because according to their ideas, they're both evolutionists. They accept the current Darwinian evolutionary theory of human origins, which has humans like us appearing less than 200,000 years ago. They, according to their understanding, humans like us did not exist 3,700,000 years ago. So, how did they explain the footprints? Well, they proposed there must have been some kind of ape man, some kind of hominin is the technical term, that existed 3,700,000 years ago. And this ape man or hominin had feet exactly like modern human feet, and that's how the footprints got made. Now that's an interesting proposal, but really there isn't any scientific evidence to support it. We have the skeletons of the ape men that existed at that time, 3,700,000 years ago. They're called Australopithecus. And in South Africa, at a place called Sterkfontein, foot bones of Australopithecus have been discovered, a fairly complete foot skeleton. And the foot structure of Australopithecus is not like that of a modern human being. It's something like that of a chimpanzee. If you look at the foot of a chimpanzee, you'll see it has very long toes, kind of like human fingers, and a long first toe that can move out to the side like a human thumb. If you look at your thumb, you see you can make it parallel to your fingers, but you can also spread your thumb at a 90-degree angle to your other fingers. Mm-hmm. So the foot of Australopithecus is kind of like that, according to the skeletal structure. Actually, the only creature known to science today that has a foot exactly like that of a modern human being is, in fact, a human being like ourselves, Homo sapiens. Mm-hmm. So what did Mary Leakey actually find? I think, she found evidence that human beings like us were existing 3,700,000 years ago. Now, some people might say, okay, well, footprints, they're a little ambiguous. It would be better if you had human skeletons that age. And such things have been reported in the scientific literature. In the late 19th century, the Italian geologist Giuseppe Ragazzoni found human skeletons in his excavations at a place called Castanetaro in northern Italy in the foothills of the Alps there. And he found several of these skeletons. He found them in layers of rock that date back to the Middle Pliocene period, which goes back about 4 million years. So there have been human skeletons found in layers of rock 4 million years old, roughly the same age as the footprints from Lake Toli that Mary Leakey reported in 1979. Now, regarding Dr. Ragazzoni's discoveries of human skeletons in layers of rock 4 million years old, some scientists will propose, well, it's easy to explain a discovery like that, they'll say. Maybe they'll propose maybe 4,000 years ago or something like that, a human being died on the surface of the ground, and then his companions dug a grave down into the ancient layer of rock, 4 million years old, and they put the body down there, they filled in the grave, and then later, they would say Dr. Ragazzoni was doing this excavation, and that explains why it appeared that he had found a human skeleton in layers of rock 4 million years old. Now, things like that can happen. I mean, technically it's called intrusive burial. So that means, it does happen sometimes that in ancient times, maybe a few thousand years ago, somebody dug a grave and put a skeleton into some ancient layer of rock. That does happen. But in this particular case, the discoverer, Dr. Ragazzoni, was a professional geologist, and he was very much aware of this problem. And he said in his original report, which I read, that if it had been a burial, then the layers of rock above the skeleton would have been disturbed, because there are several layers of rock of different color and consistency above the layer where the skeleton was found. So he said if it had been a burial, then those layers of rock above the skeleton would have been disturbed, mixed up. Mm-hmm. And he said in his original report, he looked very carefully when he was conducting his excavation, and he could see that all the layers of rock above the skeleton were intact and undisturbed. And actually, he said, each layer of rock above the skeleton, each of them was made up of dozens of smaller layers, and they were all undisturbed, mm-hmm. indicating that there had not been a burial, and the skeletons really did belong in the layers of rock in which they were found. In this case, about 4 million years old.
Mm-hmm. There was a skeleton found in Illinois 100 feet below ground as well, wasn't there?
Well, there was the case that was reported in a scientific journal called The Geologist in the year 1862. And according to the report, an anatomically modern human skeleton was found about 90 feet below the surface of the ground, if I remember correctly. And one of the important details was that above the layer in which the skeleton was found was a thick layer of slate rock that extended for many yards in all directions, And this layer of slate rock above the skeleton was unbroken, which rules out the possibility that it was a burial. And this was found 90 feet below the surface of the ground.
Yeah, 90-foot burial.
People normally don't do that. This was in Macoupin County, Illinois, which is in the St. Louis area. So, according to the State Geological Survey of Illinois, the layer where the skeleton was found was about 300 million years old, which is before the time of the dinosaurs even.
That's amazing. Absolutely amazing. It's hard
to even, if there were just one or two of these cases, if there were just a few of them, well, maybe you could dismiss them a little more easily. But what I found really fascinating is that there are hundreds of these cases that I've documented in my book, Forbidden Archaeology. And to me, that's what was really surprising. When I initially started doing the research, I thought, let me look into the history of archaeology. If you look in the current textbooks, you're not going to find any of this evidence. And you might think, well, there isn't any such evidence. But I thought, okay, let me look beyond the textbooks. Let me look into the original scientific reports published by archaeologists and geologists and other scientists who are digging into the ground. And let me just see if anything turns up there. And I thought, maybe I'll find a few cases, I'll write a short article about it, and then I'll move on to some other question. But when I got into this research, and I started digging into those original reports and these out-of-print, very difficult to locate scientific publications, I was really surprised because I would find one case and it would lead to another, which would lead to another, which would lead to another. Sometimes you get some hint of this in modern investigations about, the intelligence services and things like that. And stuff turns up that you just wouldn't expect sometimes. Mm-hmm. But it was, I thought originally maybe I'll do 8 days of research, I'll write a short little article about it, and I'll move on to something else. But the 8 days turned into 8 weeks, and the 8 weeks turned into 8 months, and the 8 months turned into 8 years. And it was enough to fill up a 900-page book. So that's, because sometimes people ask me, well, what's the most interesting case that you found? But to me, it's not that any single particular case is really so significant. What is really significant to me is the huge number of such cases which are to be found published in the scientific literature. And I went through these original scientific reports, not just in the English language. I went through them in German, Italian, French, Spanish. I have a reading knowledge of these languages. I'm not a fluent speaker of them, but I can go through an archaeological report in these languages. So I decided, I'm going to look at all the reports, from the time of Darwin all the way up to the present. And when I did that, I found there were just a huge number of discoveries of human bones, human artifacts, human footprints, going back many many millions of years, much further back in time than most scientists are now prepared to accept.
Mm. It seems that Illinois has quite an extreme history. There was also a copper coin found there, I believe, in a well boring at a depth of 114 feet. Is that correct?
Yes, I think that was in a place called Lawn Ridge, Illinois. This again was in the 19th century, around the 1870s. There was a researcher from the Smithsonian Institution named William Dubois who reported on this discovery. Now, someone was drilling a well at this place, Lawn Ridge in Illinois. And as the well was going down into the ground, this copper object came up, in the shape of a coin. And on both sides of it, it had some script in an unknown language and some figures of obviously human beings on it. And it came up, from a depth of about 125 feet, according to one of the reports, and there was another report that said 114 feet.
Yeah, just to put that in perspective real quick, the Statue of Liberty is 150 feet tall from its base to the top of the torch. So just for all the listeners, that's really far underground. Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Indeed.
Yeah.
So what this researcher from the Smithsonian Institution did is he got a hold of the drilling record for this well that had been drilled. And, the drilling record gave a report that you go down through so many feet of clay and so many feet of sand and so many feet of gravel and, all the way down to that 125-foot level. So what we did when we were doing the research for the book Forbidden Archaeology is we got in touch with the Geological Survey of the state of Illinois, and we gave them the drilling record and asked them, how old is the layer at the 125-foot level? So we didn't tell them about the coin-like copper object that had come up from that level, because sometimes if you do that, you don't get a reply. We just made a simple request: how old is level in this drilling record at the 125-foot level? And the report we got back from the geologist of the Illinois State Geological Survey was that layer is between 200,000 and 400,000 years ago. So, to put it into perspective, most scientists don't believe there were any human beings like us around between 200,000 and 400,000 years ago. And especially not producing coin-like objects. It looks like a coin. It's got scripture on it. It's got an inscription on it, some figures on it. According to the standard historical kind of reasoning, the first coins were made about 1500 BC in a place called Lydia in Asia Minor. In other words, the part of the world that Turkey now occupies. Mm-hmm. So, and that kind of indicates that if you have a coin, it means you have some kind of developed economy, some kind of government
Right.
going on. So to have that kind of evidence in North America at between 200,000 and 400,000 years ago is really kind of amazing. The current standard idea is that humans entered North America maybe about 25,000 years ago at most, coming over the standard idea is they came over from northeastern Asia, Siberia, Korea, that part of the world. They came, there was a land bridge at that time between Siberia and Alaska. You could walk across. There was a land bridge.
Mm-hmm.
So they think around that time, that's when humans first entered North America. But, I mean, we were talking earlier about the California gold mine discoveries showing a human presence going back 50 million years. And here, in the case of this Long Ridge, Illinois discovery, we've got a copper coin-like object coming out of a well boring 125 feet deep from deposits between 200,000 and 400,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm. That's absolutely amazing. Moving on to a couple other cases of extreme antiquity with the capital E. How about this metallic vase that was discovered in Boston, I believe? It was from a layer of rock that was dated 600 million years old.
Well, that's a report that comes from Scientific American from the year 1852. It tells of an excavation that was being conducted in Dorchester, which is in the Boston area in Massachusetts. Workers were excavating a foundation for a building, and about 15 feet deep, from they think this beautiful metallic vase with silver inlaid floral patterns on it came from about 15 feet deep in solid rock, from this place. And we asked the United States Geological Survey, what is the formation called there? And they said it's called the Roxbury Conglomerate, the formation at that depth, at that place. And they said it's about 600 million years old. So according to the standard evolutionary picture of the history of life on Earth, there shouldn't have been any life on the land whatsoever at that time, according to the standard view of things. Now, like my view is, humans have been around since the very beginning of the history of life on Earth. And this is one piece of evidence that would tend to support that idea. But this is, as you said, one of the more extreme anomalies.
Mm-hmm. It'd be great to be able to see this vase that was unearthed. I wish I knew its whereabouts.
Yeah, sometimes things are available and sometimes they aren't. As much as possible, I like to verify the existence of the kinds of things that I report. For example, the California gold mine discoveries. I was able to see those artifacts in the collection of the Museum of Anthropology at the University of California at Berkeley. And I was able to do it because I knew the history of them. For the ordinary person, you never even suspect these things are in the museum collections. because they're not really displayed, or even if they are displayed, the correct ages aren't given.
Mm-hmm.
But but I think in this case of this discovery, I some of the additional research I did after forbidden archaeology was discovered, it seems from some reports that I got that this vase had been in the collection of a museum in Boston, but that was what they call de-accessed.
Uh-huh.
Accession means they put it in their collection. When they take it out of the collection, it's de-accessed. Sometimes you see photographs on the web that purport to show this object, but they really don't match the description that's given in the report that was published in Scientific American, which says that it was about, it was bell-shaped. It was about 4.5 inches high, 6.5 inches in diameter at the base, 2.5 inches in diameter across the top. And so it's like you, I would be really interested in seeing if this object could be located somewhere, but up to the present time, I haven't really been able to do that.
Yeah. Did you ever get a chance to see that iron hammer that was found in Texas, I believe, embedded in the rock? Did you ever get to see
that? Was found in London, Texas.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was found in very, very ancient layers of rock going back over 100 million years. And I was able to see that in the collection that Klaus Donner put together in Vienna, Austria some years ago. As I was mentioning previously, he was able to get from private collections a lot of these artifacts from different places around the world and bring them together for a display that he put on in a museum in Vienna, Austria some years ago. Of course, it was just a temporary exhibit, so now they've gone back to their homes, wherever they are around the world. But I think that object, I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's on display in a museum of creation, and around Glen Rose, Texas.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was a museum that was put together by a Christian creationist scientist or researcher, Carl Baugh,
Mm-hmm.
B-A-U-G-H,
Mm-hmm.
who I met in Vienna when he had that London, Texas hammer and the iron pot from the Oklahoma coal mine along with some other things, on display at that exhibit that Klaus Donner organized in Vienna some years ago.
Mm-hmm. It'd be great to see a permanent home in a museum of extreme antiquity for all these artifacts to live at, for the whole world to come marvel at, Michael, moving on to science in general and the theory of evolution, let's talk about what it means to be an authentic scientist versus a quote-unquote scientist, and also the theory of evolution with an emphasis on theory. Why is it that you think this theory is driven in as a law almost, and people sort of take it as sort of written in stone gospel truth?
Well, one thing I'd like to say is I do believe in intellectual freedom, and I respect the right of each individual to make up his or her own mind about these questions. If somebody listens to what I say or reads my books and doesn't find them persuasive, and I respect that person's right to come to such a conclusion. I'm grateful that they at least investigated, but I respect their right to come to any conclusion that makes sense to them. And if somebody, on the basis of whatever study they've been able to do, after having considered all the alternatives, concludes the Darwinian theory of evolution makes best sense to them, I respect that person's right to do that. What I don't think a person has a right to do is to use government to force their ideas on others to the exclusion of all other ideas. And unfortunately, that's what I think is going on in the world today. In most countries, the supporters of the Darwinian theory of evolution have managed to convince governments, either on the national or the state or the local level, to give them a monopoly in the public tax-supported school systems. And this is in spite of the fact that there are people in the world of science who have different ideas. For example, there are scientists who are proposing alternatives to the Darwinian theory of evolution, like intelligent design, for example, or various kinds of creationist ideas. So those scientists who are proposing the alternatives, they're in the minority, but they do exist. And I don't think it's really a good idea, to say, okay, the supporters of the Darwinian theory of evolution, they're in the majority, so they should have a monopoly in the education system. The fair thing to do, I think, is to just admit, okay, today, I don't think any real comprehensive surveys have been done, but let's just assume something like 95% or 96% of the scientists in biology and those allied disciplines accept the Darwinian theory of evolution. Okay, fine. Give them 95 or 96% of the textbook pages and classroom time for their theory, but acknowledge in the remaining pages of the textbooks and classroom time in a neutral and objective way that there are a minority of scientists who are proposing alternative ideas and explain what those ideas and the reasons for them are, and then let students make up their own minds. Mm-hmm. I think that would be the fair thing to do. It's like with religion, for example. You could say, okay, America, say the United States or any other country in some other part of the world, is a majority Christian nation. Therefore, in the textbooks of history, only Christianity should be mentioned. No mention of Judaism, no mention of Islam, no mention of Buddhism, or anything like that, even though representatives of these faiths have always been present in the United States. We normally wouldn't tolerate something like that. the government giving a monopoly to one religion, even a minority religion, in terms of the textbooks of history or culture in this country. So I think the same thing is also true in the scientific realm. It may be that a majority of scientists today accept the Darwinian theory of evolution. That is a fact. But it's also a fact that there is a minority of scientists and researchers who are proposing alternatives to that theory who don't accept that theory. Mm-hmm. And I think the fair thing to do in a country that considers itself to be democratic and free is to represent the diversity of opinion that is there in the textbooks. And here I wouldn't be asking for equal time. I'd be asking for proportional time mm-hmm. and space. Mm-hmm. If 95% accept the Darwinian theory of evolution, then give them 95% of the textbook pages and classroom time. Then the remaining pages and remaining hours of classroom time, let alternatives be presented in a neutral and objective way. Mm-hmm. It's not like you could say, all right, we're going to give every religion a place in the history textbooks, but you're going to do it in an extremely negative and prejudicial way. Mm-hmm. That wouldn't be accepted in this country. Yeah. So I think if something like that were done, I think gradually over time we would see things shifting a little bit. Mm-hmm. Because if the alternatives, and one thing I'd like to point out in terms of, I've been talking now about, opinions within the scientific world. If we look at the general public, Gallup surveys have been done about the beliefs of the American people about evolution, and only about 15% or so of the American people accept the Darwinian theory of evolution as it's taught by scientists in the education system. About 25% accept some kind of evolution guided by God, which the scientific supporters of the Darwinian theory of evolution completely reject. They don't think there's any divine guidance. They see it as a purely naturalistic process. And then there are about between 50 and 60% of the American people who don't accept any kind of evolution, either purely materialistic or guided by God. They see that God put human beings on Earth in their present form in the very beginning. And I'm kind of in that category myself. So the vast majority of the American people, surveys have shown, really don't accept the Darwinian theory of evolution as it's taught by its scientific supporters. And they're paying their tax money to the government that is using it to give the supporters of the Darwinian theory of evolution an exclusive monopoly in the education system to try to force that idea on everyone without acknowledging that there are alternatives. Mm-hmm. And even within the scientific world, there are some scientists, a minority, true, but in countries that consider themselves free and democratic, even minorities have rights.
Yeah.
They're not.
Sorry, go ahead.
But no, you go ahead. I'm just kind of going, you gave me a little soapbox, and I did.
Yeah, part of me wants to think it might just be ignorance gone haywire, but another part of me is thinking maybe this is a concerted effort to condition the young people of America to a certain way of mind. Who knows?
I think there is an element of that, and I think it has something to do with some decisions that scientists made a couple of centuries ago. Because if you go back a few centuries, even in the Western world, in Europe and other places like the United States, the scientific picture of reality included many things that are now excluded, like subtle vital energies, consciousness as an element that could exist apart from matter, the idea of there being some kind of intelligence, cosmic or divine intelligence, behind some of the order and complexity that we observe around us. These things were a prominent part of scientific thought a few centuries ago, but scientists made a decision to try to concentrate just on ordinary matter operating according to mathematically expressible laws. And that was profitable for them in this sense. When they decided just to concentrate on ordinary matter and not on the more subtle energies and divine intelligence and non-material substances and things like that had been a part of the scientific picture of reality, and just focus on hard matter operating according to the chemical and physical laws, it was very productive for science in the sense that they were able to develop a lot of control over matter, a lot of control and understanding, and from that understanding and control they were able to develop technologies, pharmaceuticals, consumer products, weapons that governments wanted, that corporations wanted, and they were willing to give scientists huge amounts of money, power, and influence in exchange for those things. But it was at the expense, I believe, of having a complete picture of reality. Because now, according to this scientific picture of reality, what are we as human beings? According to, say, Richard Dawkins, for example, prominent British evolutionary scientist, he said, we're survival machines. We're robot vehicles blindly programmed to preserve the selfish molecules known as genes. So he expressed it in a very polemical way, but basically that's the view that's being presented to students in schools and colleges in this country and all over the world. You want to know what you are? Basically, you're a machine made of molecules. Mm-hmm. And as far as consciousness is concerned, well, that's just due to chemicals interacting in the brain. They produce what we call consciousness. But at the time of death, when the chemicals in the brain become disorganized, there is no more consciousness. It's a very materialistic picture of who we are. Mm-hmm. And if we define ourselves in this very materialistic way, then our goals and values become very materialistic.
Mm-hmm.
We think that to produce and consume more and more material things is the prime purpose of human life. And so we begin to devote ourselves to that, not just individually, but collectively in terms of competing groups, because the Darwinian evolutionary picture of things is where machines, the molecules, in competition with each other for survival.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that inspires a civilization that has become extremely materialistic, so that we think that to produce and consume more and more material things in competing groups is the main purpose of human life. It means that we exhaust the earth's resources and we pollute the earth, and we poison the air, we poison the land, we poison the water. We compete on the national scale for control of resources like oil and coal and things like that. And we see intense levels of conflict in the world as a result of these things. And we also see a lot of economic iniquity, where the top 1%, they're able to game the system so they get an unfair share of the resources that are generated by all of this economic activity. So you could ask, well, what if people had a different sense of identity, that were not just machines made of molecules, that consciousness exists independently of matter? It has its own existence apart from matter. Matter does not produce consciousness. Consciousness has its own independent existence. Somehow or other, as conscious selves, we've come in contact with matter, but our real purpose in life is to restore consciousness to its original pure state, beyond contact with matter. If that was our definition of who we are, then we would have an entirely different purpose in life. Mm-hmm. We would be thinking, no, the purpose of life is not to engage in unlimited production and consumption of more and more material things. Our real purpose in life is to develop the resource of consciousness. And to do that, we should try to satisfy our material needs in the most simple, natural, and efficient way possible, while putting most of our human energy into developing that resource of consciousness. Mm-hmm. But that would mean an entirely different kind of human civilization. It would mean the end of the current financial, political, economic, cultural, and scientific and educational institutions, which are all now focused on the domination and control and exploitation of matter, mm-hmm. in terms of competing groups of machines made of molecules. Mm-hmm. So basically, I think what the scientific world is doing is trying their role in keeping this whole system intact is to enforce on people, through the monopoly they have in the education system, a conception of the self as a machine made of molecules that has somehow or other evolved on this planet. Mm-hmm. And to keep, if we have that materialistic sense of identity, then will adopt the kinds of materialistic values and goals that keep the whole system going.
Hmm. Yeah, to me, real science transcends materialism. I mean, a real scientist would understand that, he's only able to perceive the tiniest fraction of the electromagnetic spectrum, and a real scientist is intellectually honest, has an open mind to all possibilities, a willingness to question everything, and lets logic and facts and evidence and reason determine his course. It's good to have an open mind because paradigms are always shifting. I mean, you never know when one idea can become totally passe. Like the surgeon who advocated washing your hands before performing surgery. All his fellow scientific community was laughing at him and ridiculing him for advocating washing your hands before you perform the surgery. And yeah, I guess in the end, reason and logic prevails, but sometimes it takes a little while, right?
Yeah. Well, one thing I want to say is I'm going to be talking about all these things at a conference called Free Your Mind, which is going to be held the weekend of April 7 through 9 in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, at the Sheraton Hotel there. I'm going to be speaking there as part of that conference about my book, Forbidden Archaeology, and the kinds of issues that it raises. Because, as you've seen, we started talking about stones and bones, archaeological evidence for extreme human antiquity, and now we've gotten into all these other, deeper topics related to the real nature of what a human being is and what our purpose in life and what the purpose of science should be in terms of all that. So I think because sometimes people would ask me, well, what difference does it make whether human beings have been around a couple 100,000 years or many millions of years? What difference does it really make? And the difference that it makes is that if there is evidence, that we've been around for tens of millions, even hundreds of millions of years, it means we need new explanations for human origins that go beyond the Darwinian theory of evolution. And those alternatives, if you look at them, they all tend to involve non-material principles, some concept of consciousness being apart from matter, some concept that there's some kind of cosmic intelligence that's behind the universe. So these things are excluded from the modern scientific research program. You can look at science in terms of it being a game. And the rules of the game now are that you cannot bring in non-material substance. That's just one of the rules that has been adopted. And another rule is you can't bring in intelligence, divine intelligence, being responsible for any of the order, complexity that we observe around us. Those are rules of science. And you can play the game according to those rules if you want, but it's at the expense of having a complete picture of reality. I think a real science should include everything that's possibly true about the world that we live in without putting anything out of bounds. So what if it's true that there is non-material substance? What if it's true that there is some guiding intelligence that's responsible for some of the order and complexity that we observe around us. Uh, I think it's possible to carry out scientific research with another set of rules that would allow scientists to consider these possibilities. And actually, if you look in the past, even in the fairly recent history of science, going back 1 or 2 centuries, you'll see that there was metaphysical diversity in science, even in Europe, in the West. Say around the time of Darwin. At the time of Darwin, the scientific community in England, in terms of the biological sciences, was basically in the hands of those following a Judeo-Christian metaphysics. And they believed in a doctrine called special creation, and this was actually being taught in the scientific departments of the universities of Oxford and Cambridge and things like that. And Darwin had a different idea. He was a strict materialist, and he was proposing an alternative to the dominant scientific ideas of his time. So Darwin was operating according to a strictly materialistic metaphysics. The biologists and other life scientists in the universities at that time were operating according to a Judeo-Christian metaphysics. And it didn't end there. There was another prominent British biologist named Robert Owen, and he was operating according to a Platonic metaphysics. He thought that on some higher level of reality there were original forms of animals, and that by a process of reflection, these original transcendental forms were reflected into the world of matter, where they helped organize, these forms, these Platonic forms provided the structure for organisms in the world of matter. So it was a Platonic metaphysics. And then in Europe, especially in Germany, there were biologists who were operating according to the idea that there were vital forces and energies that had something to do with the structure of organisms in the world. So you had, at that time, in the world of science, metaphysical diversity. You had people operating like Darwin according to a strictly materialist metaphysics. You had scientists operating according to Judeo-Christian metaphysics. You had scientists conducting their scientific research according to Platonic metaphysics. You had other scientists in Europe conducting their biological research according to a metaphysics that involved vital forces and energies. So you had metaphysical diversity in science. I think it's only very recently that the world of science has been completely dominated by a strictly materialistic metaphysics. So I think it's time to reintroduce metaphysical diversity into the world of science. And I think that would be a positive step forward at the present moment.
I'm in complete agreement with you. Michael, the opening line for your book, Human De-Evolution, A Vedic Alternative to Darwin's Theory, if you don't mind me repeating it, I think it's very telling, and it just sort of It's worth a million words. By next Friday evening, they will all be convinced that they are monkeys. And that was from Thomas Huxley in a letter. Is that kind of like telling a magical golden vessel inlaid with precious gems and beautifully crafted that it was made from recycled beer cans?
Yeah, I mean, that is, no, there was a definite plan. You know, Huxley was a scientific friend of Darwin, a supporter of Darwin, and he was popularly known as Darwin's bulldog. And you have to remember that Darwin himself, when he started his work, he was outside of the education system and the scientific institutions. And it's one thing that I actually respect about him, that at a time when nobody accepted his ideas, he had the courage to put them forth. And he recruited some initial supporters like Huxley, who worked very hard to promote his ideas. Huxley was called Darwin's bulldog. But another thing that I found very interesting in looking at Darwin's early history was his relationship to Alfred Russel Wallace, who was another English biologist, a little younger than Darwin. Darwin had originally been a creationist. He was educated in the British universities, which were dominated by supporters of the theory of special creation, the idea that God specifically created each form of life, each species separately, and they didn't come one from the other. So originally Darwin had that idea, but after he left college, he went on a cruise on this British naval ship called the Beagle, and he went on the cruise as a scientist. And it was during that cruise, when he went to the Galapagos Islands and studied nature in a lot of different countries, that he began to think of the evolution theory. And he went home to England and he began working on his book, The Origin of Species. And he was working on it for many years, actually about 20 years. And then one day he gets in the mail a letter from this younger scientist named Wallace, who included a copy of a paper he was going to have presented at a meeting of a scientific society in London. And in this paper, Wallace outlined the theory of evolution by natural selection, the same theory that Darwin had been thinking about for 20 years and was writing his book about it, but had never publicly stated it. So Darwin was really shocked, because the way things worked in the scientific world was that whoever first presented a public paper about a theory would get the credit for it. So Darwin was really shocked. He'd been working on this book, The Origin of Species, for about 20 years. And then all of a sudden, he finds out this other scientist has come up with the same idea, basically, and was going to have it presented at a scientific society in London and published, which means that Wallace would have gotten the credit for the theory of evolution by natural selection. So Darwin called his scientific friends together and to try to decide what to do, and they advised him the only thing you could really do is propose to Wallace that both Wallace and Darwin would present papers at this same conference to be held at this scientific society in London. It's called the Linnean Society. And if they did that, then they would both get credit for the theory. So Wallace agreed to that. And for a long time, the theory was known as the Wallace-Darwin theory of evolution. And you may ask, okay, well, why isn't it still called the Wallace-Darwin theory of evolution? And it's because Wallace, being what you and I would call a more open-minded scientist, open to a lot of different possibilities, he'd become involved in research into the paranormal. And he had begun to realize there's something more to a human being than ordinary matter. You know, that the human mind and human consciousness were symptomatic of some other kind of element being there in human existence, something non-material and with powers that go beyond what can be explained by the current laws of physics and chemistry. So he got involved in psychical research, research into the paranormal, and he began to conclude there is a non-material element to the human essence, and it's connected with a higher intelligence that's guiding the whole process, and that there are higher beings and people with what might be called supernatural or paranormal powers. And he joined some other English scientists in scientifically researching these things. He was doing research with mediums and things like that, investigating psychokinesis and other paranormal phenomena. And it very much upset Darwin. I mean, Darwin wrote to him and said, yeah, by getting involved in all of this, you're going to murder our child, the theory of evolution. And it really, I mean, the things that Wallace was researching as a scientist really did open up a whole new world of investigation. And Darwin just couldn't handle it, and neither could most of the other scientists. So Wallace was, you could say, exiled, and now it's just called the Darwinian theory of evolution by natural selection.
Mm-hmm. And just to repeat, it is called the theory of Darwinian evolution because it's actually never been proven. A lot of these Darwinian people will say, humans and chimpanzees have such close DNA, they share so much DNA, but yeah, I mean, if you compare a human's DNA with a banana's DNA, they share 60% of the genes, so.
Well, what the DNA does is tell a cell how to produce a protein. Yeah, proteins are made up of amino acids. There are basically about 12 kinds of amino acids in the human body. And basically what a gene does is it tells a cell how to put together amino acids in chains to form different proteins. There are thousands of different kinds of proteins in the human body, and basically, it's not the only thing a gene does, but basically that's what it does. It tells a cell how to string together amino acids to form proteins, which are the building blocks of an organism. Now, to me, it's not surprising that there's genetic similarity between apes and human beings because our bodies are made of the same kinds of proteins. But that doesn't mean that genes explain everything. Like your cell phone and your iPad, for example, are made of basically the same materials, but they're separately designed and separately manufactured. So the fact that they contain 90% the same materials isn't very surprising, but neither is it surprising that one didn't evolve from the other. They were separately designed, separately manufactured. So it's not surprising to me that ape or a chimpanzee would have 90 or 95% similarity in the genes that we would find in a human organism, because both a human being and a chimpanzee contain basically the same kinds of proteins, mostly. And it's not a sign that one evolved from the other any more than the sign that your mobile phone and your laptop computer are basically made of the same kinds of elements. Still, they're separately designed, separately manufactured. And I would say the same thing is true of the bodies of all the different kinds of animals and human beings and plants and insects and fish. They're basically made of the same kinds of elements, but that doesn't prove that one evolved from the other. To demonstrate that, you have to show something else. Just basic similarity of elements does not rule out that they were separately designed and manufactured.
Right. Yeah, there's the old saying, correlation is not causation. All these different kinds of primates didn't necessarily all emerge from one another. They could have been coexisting since time immemorial.
And that's what that's one of the things that the evidence I documented in Forbidden Archaeology shows, that if you look at all the evidence, it doesn't add up to a picture of human beings evolving from apes and monkeys, by way of ape men. It adds up to a picture of coexistence of humans, ape men, and apes and monkeys going back millions of years.
Mm-hmm. Michael, let's talk a little bit about what it means for us in general to understand that man's history extends far beyond than what the textbook says in terms of sociological and sociocultural effects. To me, it stimulates my imagination to think that man could possibly have no beginning or no end. The eternal nature of man. It opens my mind to just wonder. So what are some other things along those lines that you might want to add?
Well, the key thing for me is that the human body, or any other type of body, is a vehicle for a conscious self, which is non-material. The vehicle is made of matter, and it has a beginning and it has an end. But the conscious self, I believe, has no beginning, no end. It is meant to exist on some higher level of reality that I call the level of pure consciousness. And on that level of pure consciousness, the conscious self exists in harmony with all other conscious selves and with the source of all conscious cells. I think there is a source. So you could ask, well, if that's the case, then what are we doing here? The ruling principle of that level of pure consciousness, as I call it, is unselfish love. But if a conscious self becomes egotistical and develops a desire to control, exploit, dominate others, then such a conscious self cannot exist on that level of pure consciousness anymore. So there has to be some alternative reality for such conscious selves where they can act out their desires to dominate, control, exploit others for selfish purposes. Mm-hmm. And that alternative is this world. And the world is made of a different energy, matter. So to function in the world of matter, the conscious self requires a vehicle that it can use for its purposes, because as far as its original identity is concerned, its original identity as a being of pure consciousness, it can't function in this world of matter in that way. So it requires another vehicle. So that's what our bodies are. The human vehicle, the plant vehicle, the insect vehicle, the bird vehicle, the dog or cat vehicle. They're all vehicles for conscious selves. And according to the vehicle, the conscious self is able to express itself to a greater or lesser degree. But it's the same conscious self in all the different vehicles. For example, if I'm a human being and I get on a skateboard, I can do certain things. If I get on a bicycle, I can do other things. If I get on a motorbike, then I can ride faster and further. If I get in a car, I can operate in a more effective way on the road. If I get in a boat, I can go on the water. If I get in a submarine, I can go under the water. If I get in an airplane, I can fly around in the sky. If I get in a space capsule, I can travel around the Earth in space. I'm the same person, but according to the vehicle that I'm in, I can operate in different ways. And the human vehicle is a very special one because in the human vehicle, it's possible to understand the real nature of the conscious self and act in such a way that the conscious self is qualified, educated, and trained to exist once more on that higher level of reality, the level of pure consciousness beyond the world of matter, which is full of limitations like birth, death, old age, disease, things of that nature. It's very temporary and limiting. So each conscious self, especially in the human vehicle, has that opportunity. And in that sense, as conscious selves, I'd say we're all extraterrestrial beings because that conscious self has come from some higher level of reality. It's not from the world of matter. So the real, people like to talk about, how to judge the success of a nation or a civilization. I believe the ultimate measure of success of a civilization or a nation or any other social group is how many conscious selves that are part of that group or nation or civilization are elevating themselves beyond the world of matter.
Mm-hmm.
That is the ultimate measure of a nation's success, you could say, if you want to put it on a national level. How many of the conscious selves that are part of that nation are becoming freed from contact with matter? And there have been times in the long history of the earth where there have been civilizations. For example, the civilization described in the ancient Sanskrit writings of India. There have been civilizations that have been organized to facilitate that. They've been organized so as to provide the material needs of people in the most simple, natural, and efficient way possible, while at the same time giving the conscious selves that are part of that civilization the education and training and practice necessary to elevate consciousness beyond the world of matter. So that would, for me, be the ideal kind of civilization or culture. Of course, now things aren't organized like that. Most countries and civilizations in the world today are not organized with that in mind, and we're living with the result.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when we all understand that we're all expressions of God, we're probably going to be less likely to try to take advantage and harm others for material gains and those kinds of dim things. There's a quote from Human De-Evolution that I like a lot. It's as rays of the sun are simultaneously one with and different from the sun, all souls are simultaneously one with and different from the Supreme Soul. I thought that was really just very profound. Yeah, that's good stuff.
Yeah. If we have the idea, as Richard Dawkins says, that we're survival machines, robot vehicles blindly programmed to preserve the selfish molecules known as genes, then we're going to be living in a certain way. We're going to have certain goals, and they're going to be focused on getting as much as you can, which means if there's a financial and economic system, some people are going to exploit it at the expense of others. There's going to be intense levels of greed and competition and conflict. That's what we're going to have, a lot of environmental devastation. And then at the time of death, come back for another round and another round and another round. I believe in reincarnation. So if we have this other idea that I'm a being of pure consciousness, you're a being of pure consciousness, we're all beings of pure consciousness, we're all part of God, as you say, the supreme conscious being, then we'll see ourselves as related and not divided up into so many competing, conflicting groups. We'll be able to appreciate, we'll all have our distinct identities, and there'll be variety, but there'll also be unity along with that diversity. because we'll perceive ourselves as related on some fundamental level. And that vision, which I think people have, they aspire for, but society isn't arranged at the present moment to facilitate that kind of understanding.
Mm-hmm. So, Michael, are you fluent in Sanskrit?
I wouldn't say fluent. I studied the ancient Sanskrit writings. I know some of the basics of the Sanskrit language and can read the ancient Devanagari text. I wouldn't say I'm the best Sanskrit scholar on earth. I'd say my understanding of it is rudimentary, but when I study the Sanskrit texts like Bhagavad Gita or the Bhagavad Purana, I look at the original script. I learned about these texts from my guru. When I was younger, I became the disciple of a guru from India, His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. And he translated many of these ancient Sanskrit works into English, but he did it in an interesting way. He presented the original Sanskrit script. It's called Devanagari script. And then he put it in each word into an English transliteration and defined each word. And then he gave a translation of the whole passage in English. And then he gave a commentary on each text to explain it a little further. So it's possible to just look at the original Sanskrit text, which I do. I've taught myself to read it. And then I look at how each word was translated, and you can make your judgment if it's been translated correctly or not. I believe it has been. If you take a Sanskrit dictionary and look, you can see things have been translated properly. So in the 40 years I've been studying these texts, I've, by forcing myself to read the original Sanskrit text, I've learned something about it, but I wouldn't say I'm totally fluent in it or that I'm the best Sanskrit scholar, but I do know something.
Mm-hmm. I had heard that the root for the word human breaks down into Om, which is considered the eternal sound of the universe, and man. Not quite sure what the Sanskrit meaning of the second part of the word would be, but do you know anything a little deeper about that? The word human, Om-man, human, Om-man? Etymology is a hobby.
In Sanskrit, the word that's used is manusya.
Mm-hmm.
For the humankind, manusya. Maybe you've got another word. There's a lot of, like any language, sometimes there are many different terms for the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
So it may be that etymologically the first M is related to Om, but the Sanskrit word that I'm familiar with for human is manusya.
Okay. Cool. I'm just curious, how is it that the Indian culture has been able to maintain such a long recorded history? It's got to be the oldest on Earth. So just what special factors have been with them to have such a lengthy recording of their history?
Well, I think one thing is they've managed to preserve for a long period of time essential aspects of their culture. And for example, if we take the Egyptian culture, uh, basically the kind of culture that was represented at the time of the building of the pyramids and the Sphinx is gone now. You don't find pharaohs and representatives of that Egyptian culture conducting the rites and rituals of the culture that existed at that time. It's all gone now. The physical remnants are there, but another culture is there today. I guess they've got Coptic Christians and different Islamic sects, but not that Egyptian culture. It's no longer existing. Same with the kinds of people who built the Parthenon and the Greek monuments. You don't find today very many authentic worshipers of the Greek gods anymore. But somehow or other, the spiritual culture of India that existed in the distant past has survived right up to the present. You know, the kinds of worship and the kinds of philosophical traditions that were there thousands of years ago still are represented today. So they've had a more or less, I mean, not perfectly, but a lot of their original culture has persisted despite, so many invasions. They went through a period where they were ruled by the British and French and Portuguese. The culture has managed to survive. So that's one reason why I was attracted to it. Of course, I have my own spiritual preferences, but I don't claim to have a monopoly on truth. And I think some of the same essential messages can be found in many other spiritual traditions, which I also respect. In my book, Human Devolution, I have a chapter on cross-cultural study of cosmologies, where I look at about 35 of the world's cultures, some of them historical, some of them currently existing, and compare them. And they tend to have common elements, and they also have differences, but it's like, one feature that's very common is the idea that humans have been around since the beginning of life on Earth, that we were placed here for a purpose. It's not that we're just some accident of evolution. Also, an idea that's very common is that there is a conscious self that can survive the death of the body. That's a very common idea that's found across many different cultures. The idea that we live in a multi-level universe with higher beings at different levels is something that's very common across cultures. So I think the reason for that is that the representatives of these cultures are considering from their different perspectives the same ultimate reality. It's like if you have people looking at a mountain from different directions, from the north, the south, the east, or the west, their descriptions of the mountain may be slightly different, yet at the same time, it's obvious that they're looking at the same reality, just from their different perspectives. So I think it's something like that, although, everyone has to make some decision, like if you're going to buy a car, there's so many different kinds of cars to get, though. They've all got four wheels, but you've got to choose one that's right for you. So I think it's the same in terms of spirituality. There are many different kinds of spirituality, and a person has to make their choice what's best for them. I mean, they could have a discussion, well, ultimately, which one is really the best for everybody. They could have a discussion like that. But, I don't really like the idea of exclusive claims to truth. I think it's a part of what's going wrong in the world today is so many people from different spiritual points of view are claiming to have some exclusive. It's like, if you have gold, you could form the gold into coins, and then you could stamp the coins with symbols, nations. But if it's really gold, it doesn't matter what symbol you've stamped on it. It's a person with some real intelligence will appreciate, well, it's all gold and all equally valuable, even though a different symbol may be stamped on it.
Mm-hmm.
So now, if it's not really gold, that's another question, but that can be analyzed. So in terms of spirituality, I would say, if you're coming to the understanding, I'm a being of pure consciousness, you're a being of pure consciousness, we're all beings of pure consciousness, we all come from the same source. It doesn't matter how you come to that understanding. You could call it Christianity or Islam or Judaism or Buddhism or whatever. If you come to that understanding, it doesn't matter what you call the process. If you've got the result, and it's like I said, gold coins with the symbols of different nations stamped on them.
Michael, as far as the sophistication of ancient man, especially in India, there are accounts, people who are new to this may be kind of astonished to hear this, but there's accounts of flying vehicles called vimanas, so it just kind of makes you wonder a little bit, doesn't it?
Well, there are descriptions in the ancient Sanskrit writings of vimanas, different kinds of flying craft. It's there are a lot of descriptions of them, and there are different kinds. Because the Vedic conception of the universe is a multi-level universe where you have a level of pure consciousness, a level of subtle and material energies, and then a level of gross material energies. And they're all inhabited, and there are vimanas of different kinds. There are vimanas made of pure consciousness. There are vimanas made of subtle mental energies, and there are vimanas made of gross material elements, metals. They're all there. Now, unfortunately, it's getting late for me here. And I think about 2 hours is the amount of time I budgeted for the conversation.
Yeah, I don't mean
Do you
to.
think do you think you'll be able to get something from what we have conversed?
Most definitely. I could go on till the cows come home with all this, but just from what we've
So could I, but yeah,
yeah.
I've got an early rise tomorrow.
Gotcha. Well, Michael, it was a real honor having you on, and thank you again so much for joining me, and wish you all the best. Hopefully I can catch you at a conference coming up sometime. You said the one in Pennsylvania? What's
Yeah, the Free Your Mind
Free Your,
conference.
okay.
Free Your Mind conference. It's being held at the Sheraton Hotel in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, just north of Philadelphia.
Okay.
The weekend of April 7 to 9. So it would be nice to see some of your listeners there. I'd also like to mention my website.
Please.
Yeah, if people are interested in my work, they can visit my website, mcremo.com, mcremo.com. There they'll find the travel diary where I report on my travels. They'll find a schedule of upcoming interviews and lectures. They'll also find information about my different books and things like that. So it's the first stop for anyone interested in learning a little more about these things, mcremo.com, mcremo.com.
Very good. Well, once again, Michael, thank you so much, and hope you get a good night's sleep tonight, and have a great one, man.
Okay, thank you, Andrew.
All right, take care.
Good night.
All right, good night. Bye.